Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. As always, I am so deeply appreciative for all of you taking your time to tune in and listen to my guest each week. I am super excited about my guest this week. I have been following her work since I found out about her, and I am very excited to bring her to all of you. I'd love to introduce my guest, Suzanne Anderson. She is an author, a psychologist, an executive coach, an international speaker, and founder of the Mysterial Woman Initiative, a social enterprise dedicated to the awakening, development, and support of women as integral leaders shaping a positive future for all beings. Suzanne is a master of transformative learning with a passion for awakening innate human potential. An early pioneer in the field of experiential learning, she led the way in using the outdoors as a classroom for leadership development and was the co-creator of a highly acclaimed worldwide women's empowerment program in the 90s. Suzanne was the founder of international consultancy and worked for over a decade with Fortune 500 companies. 7 of those years were based in Paris as a multilingual senior management consultant, facilitator, speaker, and leadership coach. Suzanne is the author of 2 books. She co-authored The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. And her second book is coming out in June. And I have to look up the title. And it is called You Make Your Path by Walking, a Transformational Field Guide Through Trauma and Loss. Suzanne, welcome to the show. It is an absolute thrill to have you here.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. So you have done so many incredible things in your life and the transformational work that you're doing with women. I know that you lost your husband to suicide in 2013, and I'd really love this conversation to go anywhere it needs to. So I'm gonna hand the mic over to you and let us ground us in your story and this new book that is coming out now, and we can take off from there if that works for you.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be in the conversation with you. This is the beginning of the conversations I'm going to be having around this second book, and I feel really comfortable being in your listening and conversational presence. And the book comes out in June, so this is that sort of wave moving toward the new book. And it's a very different ground from which I am speaking, the second book, than the first book. So let me sort of situate the listener in that transition. So, the sort of fast zoom over the story is recognizing many years ago, 20 years ago now, really, that women seem to be stalled inside a masculine model of wholeness. And I saw that in leadership as a leadership management consultant. The women that I worked with that were at the senior levels seemed to have become one of the boys. And I could feel it myself. I could feel how that was what you did. And actually, I would now say that was a necessary step along the way in development, but it occluded a lot of parts of ourselves as women. And so when I began to work with women, the whole, I guess it was 10 years of research, we embedded our programs right from the very beginning in universities, because I thought this exploration of what it means for women to really move to the next level of our innate potential. I don't want it to be something over in an eddy somewhere, like some new age thing or some weird study. It's like, no, this is mainstream leadership development, but not leadership from the old classical model, but really what it means to bring all of oneself into whatever it is we do, right? And how we can be influencing culture. My co-author at the time, that one of the early women that came into the work with me, Dr. Susan Cannon, her focus and her PhD had been around how cultures transform. And what she had seen, I had been studying women in development individually, like how do you sort of coax or encourage the next level of development? She'd been looking at what were the factors in evolution that let positive scenarios be be unroll in the future. And they always included some aspect of the feminine. Okay, so then we came together and said, all right, there's something here that needs to happen. We spent 10 years figuring it out. Hundreds of women in our programs, really trial and error of what worked to open this next level of potentiality. And we were ready then at the end of 10 years to bring our book. We had written the manuscript. We were ready to go. We were ready to take off. We were launching a program for the first time after we'd taken a bit of a break to write the book. And that was the end of 2012. And then on January 3rd, 2013, I came home to discover my husband was dead. I didn't know at first that he had taken his own life. And
I just want to pause right there for 2 seconds and just say, just feel my heart to yours that I think it goes without saying the intense trauma
yes,
that caused you in your life. And so please continue.
Thank you. Yeah. It's always hard to, how does one even go from, there were two different worlds, and I appreciate you asking for a pause, because literally I was ready to take off and fly, like the momentum in my body, and it was like up and out with this work to get this developmental pathway available to women around the world. And then so like life said, no, not so fast. You're going to go for a descent right now, and the deepest descent that you could imagine. And so that is exactly what happened. But this book, You Make Your Path by Walking, is the story of how I lived that. And in a way, at the end of the first book, which is, as you said, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, this way of being, we had started to see, it's full of case studies, so of women that we had worked with, and we had started to see these capacities arising that were really what I call next order capacity, ways of navigating through the world, of multidimensional knowing, of how to tend a field, how to be in a system in a really more creative way, how to embrace paradox, all these things. But it was like I then lived that. Like I lived what sometimes I talk about the work that we do as helping women upgrade their inner operating system, to use a computer metaphor.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I actually started using that years ago. Now I think it's used more often, but because it was so clear when we got into the research for those 10 years that we weren't really asking women to come up with a lot of new behaviors. That would be like rearranging the deck chairs on the sinking Titanic. It was like, no, actually, we need a whole new worldview. We have to include the deep feminine and the deep masculine. What does that even mean? And bring them together into this operating system that then, of course, gives us a lot more capacity. But it's not about shifting, getting new software out there. And so that is what I lived. And
when you say that you lived it, can we really do a deep dive into that? Because what I always think about is how we teach what we must learn. It seems that plays over and over again. And here you were. I mean, the vision that I had was literally getting ready, literally and figuratively getting ready to fly. And you come home to the most traumatic thing that you can't even begin to imagine, that completely turns your world upside down. Can you talk to us about when you say that you had to live it? What does that mean? What did that mean for you that led you to this place in time now?
Right. Well, there's so many things, but I think that maybe I'll just speak to the title of the book, because the title of the book is You Make Your Path by Walking, which is a fragment of a poem by Antonio Machado. It's a beautiful poem that is really, was a turn of the 20th century Spanish poet. And it speaks to You Make Your Path by Walking, really, that there is no path for what you must walk when your world has been erased in the way that trauma and loss can do. And sometimes, there's this thought of, oh, somebody's got a path for me and I need to take the path. What I would say is it's more, again, about you have the consciousness or the capacity to be with what is. And then you will, and there are many things, and I'll speak about some of them in a moment, that I think can be very helpful. But ultimately, you're going to find, almost like you take a step and the next stone rises up. You take a step and the next stone rises up. There is, I think this was a phrase that I repeated all the time at the beginning, and I didn't really know what it meant. I knew the poem really well, and in the early days, I would just keep saying, well, I guess I'm making my path by walking. And then eventually, when it came time to find a title for the book, I realized, well, this is the place we all have to start, which is, now, this is, to go right back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I'm sure you know her beautiful work.
Very, very well.
Yeah. Of course, in your own work, you would know. And that first phase of denial, which is necessary in a certain sense. I mean, our nervous system can't possibly take in everything. I couldn't take in everything that happened. But my work really was initially, the very first thing was to be able to be with what is. And I'll tell you, I'm going to give you a little story if I can. Yeah. Because I think this will be helpful. The way back when we first started designing our programs for women, I wanted to find a myth, like, and I'm sure you know, again, in your own work, the potency of a myth, especially that's endured over time, is that it speaks to the unconscious and the conscious mind. So it's sort of this great, and it's holding something that's, if it's endured, there's something about the kind of bones of the myth that are powerful for us. That's why stories, children's stories that people repeat again and again are so potent. So the myth that we chose way back at the beginning of our programs for women was the Persephone Demeter myth. Do you know that myth?
I feel like it sounds vaguely familiar. I think if you start telling the story, I'll either know it or I won't. So please. Okay.
I suspect you'll know it. And I suspect the readers will know parts of it, which is, it's basically the story of a maiden. That's the Greek gods. The maidens are out, Persephone's out gathering flowers with her mother Demeter, or Demeter, however one pronounces it. And Hades, who was the king of the underworld, sees her, has fallen in love with her basically. And he negotiates with Zeus, king of the gods, to have her as his bride. And so one day the earth opens up and Hades rushes up with his chariot and horses and grabs Persephone and takes her down into the underworld. Now, the majority of the myth is then about what happens. And basically she resists being there for a long time. She won't eat, she won't talk to anybody. It's like, I will not be in the dark. Do not make me be in this dark. The story unfolds, and eventually decides that it's time for her to come back, to be released, to come back to Demeter. And he sends Hermes, the messenger god, to get her. And as Hermes is bringing her back, right before she leaves, Hades says, well, would you like some pomegranate seeds? And she's getting out of Dodge anyway. She's getting out of hell. So she thinks, hey, I might as well eat something on the way out, finally. So she eats these seeds and returns to the upper world and discovers that there's the law of the time is that if you eat anything in the underworld, in this case, these seeds, she must return to the underworld. So ultimately, she's 6 months in the upper world and 6 months in the underworld. The important thing here is that ultimately, again, she becomes queen of the upper world and the underworld. She falls in love with Hades. This is when she really becomes Queen Persephone. We use this myth and we use it symbolically to take women, to signal to women that the work that I think is required is that we return to the body and we embrace the dark. Now, I've been using this myth. Do you know the myth?
I do. And it's just funny because the way that I think about it is how important it is. And I've talked about it on this podcast, to embrace our shadow side. It is just as important. It's the whole of who we are. It's our whole whole being. So yeah, please
Right.
continue. This is
Well,
beautiful.
it's 2/3 of the being. It's like the 2/3 of the iceberg is that which is not known, and shadow, which is the work that we do in our programs. The shadow is basically just anything that the conscious mind doesn't want to know. Those parts of ourselves we wisely tucked into the corners when we were growing up. So that just sets the stage here to say, I knew something about the dark. I lost my mother when I was younger. I lost many children, many miscarriages in my attempts to become a mother, and I knew something of loss. But the day that after this happened, I asked a good friend of mine, and you may know his work, Michael Mead. He works with myth and ritual, and he lives on the same island I lived on. And I asked him if he would come over, and I explained to him, he works with trauma, people in midst of trauma, had just actually been working with a high school suicide that had happened on the island, and he'd just been speaking to the high school about it. Anyway, I sat with him and I said, I just don't know, I can't, how I'll get through this. And he said, well, and he knew, he's a mythologist. We had had many conversations about this myth. He said, well, you're Queen Persephone. Let's remember that. And you are going to go into a deeper part of Hades than you've ever gone before. And you can do this, and you will do this for yourself, and you'll do this for others who won't have to journey there.
Your students.
Yeah. And we'll be in the upper world. We'll hold space for you. And I remember in that moment, the kind of like the earth opened up, or something inside me just said, okay, I'm going. Now that didn't mean I'm going to wallow in despair. It just meant I accept this path, to whatever level I could at that time. Later, I came, as the time went on, I was able to more and more accept what had happened. But in that moment, I said to myself, and I recall that feeling of just opening to what this journey would be. Of course, I could have had no idea all the places it would have taken me.
I just, again, I sometimes when I can feel myself not breathing, I know, I know I have to take a moment because it's a lot to take in. That you became the Queen of Persephone is so powerful. I felt chills, and I kind of going back to, we must learn. We teach what we must learn. And here you were preparing all of this time and not knowing you were preparing for what would be some of the darkest days of your own journey. And so, there's lots of language, right? When we surrender or lean in, or whatever language we happen to use of what is going on in our life, where did this journey take you? Because it's been 10 years now.
Yeah.
And so even if you like the little signposts, because now this book is coming out in June, can you give us sort of those high and low notes of how that day, everything you've done before that obviously had helped to prepare you. And then you had this conversation, you surrendered, it sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened next?
Yeah. Well, there's an expression I've used, but I'm sure I got it from somebody or other, about learning to see in the dark, like that idea. Actually, that sense of, something was forever shattered in me. And I think this is important to say because, I'm holding this perspective for us that when we are broken open, like this was for me, it can be, if we walk this path in a way I'm suggesting, it can be a breaking through to really a whole new experience of oneself and consciousness and of the world. I mean, but the shattering comes first. And honestly, for me, at the beginning, I remember I wrote every day in a journal, and I remember I wrote often, I don't know if I'll get through this. Like, there was a way in which my certainty, my heroic certainty, because I'd been through lots of things, as I've said. It's not like I reached this point in my life and hadn't had hard things happen, or even had wild adventures happen in my life where I wondered if I'd survive. But that got shattered, that heroic certainty of my will get me through. It's like, I don't know. But what I do know 100% is that I will make my path by walking. I will live the way of the mysterious woman that was I had spent years understanding. And if I walk myself back together again, then that'll be a solid transmission. That'll be real. Because while certainly many students had been through many difficult things in the years that I'd worked with women, nothing quite like this. So it was sort of like at every level. Now we'll just say what every level, by that what I mean in a minute. I was, the Tibetan, there's a beautiful ritual in Tibet where they make sand mandalas. Have you ever seen those?
Yes, they are absolutely exquisite. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
They
So
literally make art out of the sand, and
monks make these
yes,
beautiful
incredible.
things and very meticulously dripping sort of grains of colored sand onto this mandala, and they create elaborate and complex mandalas. And at the end, they just take a wand and they wipe it all off. And that is an image I kept having early in the beginning for myself, because I lost everything. So it's important to know, and I write about this in the book, I had met my beloved 10 years before. This is David. And really, he was the being I'd been waiting to meet. I'd been married before, and in many ways I felt everything was preparing me to meet David, and an incredible being himself. And we had an estate on Vashon Island with, it was like another world, because David was an antique Indonesian importer and a lover of these old antiques and buildings. And he had brought antique buildings from Indonesia to our property. So a temple and another little tea houses and meditation huts. And I mean, it was truly another world. And he'd spent years creating a gorgeous Japanese garden. And, this was another world into which I came, and we made our lives. And, he used to talk about sort of like he created all of this, but he was there by himself. And I write a myth in the book that, sort of like the lonely king. And then the queen came along, his partner, and it started to fill with music and all sorts of things. Okay, so that I want to create that context, because it was a whole world I was embedded in, and in this community on this island that I love. And David had gotten tinnitus, so this terrible screeching in the head, which I don't know if you know of tinnitus. Do you? Are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
There's no cure for this. There are actually a lot of people that have it, but it's just a ringing in the ears that happens. And they don't really know even why. Sometimes it happens because people listen to loud music when they're younger, or they've been around a lot of noise. Anyway, and many people feel like, I can't live with this. It's just not going to be possible.
Now, is this something that, so how long had you been with David before
10 years. 10 years. And then
before
this happened in October.
Okay.
He took his life in January.
Gotcha.
So it was very fast. And, he was a long-time meditator, had a deep spiritual practice, and then had a store in Seattle and a workshop in Indonesia, and, he had a very robust world. And this screeching in his head really took something out from underneath him. And what I discovered very quickly after he died was that his business and his world, which was very independent from my business and my work with women and leadership and the research in the university, his world was crumbling financially. And actually, it was like he'd built a house of cards and it was about to come all down.
And were you unaware of this?
Yeah, I was unaware of the extent of this. I knew that, in the retail business, that there are times when you sell more furniture, you don't. And he was always juggling from one, okay, well, I'll have to extend this line of credit or do this. But I think the combination of his vulnerable state in the tinnitus. He used to say, or he said a few times, I think I've broken something inside, like with, he didn't, I assumed he meant with meditating, but I think also there was this way in which he was stretched so thin. And I did receive a letter from him afterwards, and they aren't always healing, as people will know who have gone through suicide. I've been on the receiving end of that way that someone chooses to leave. But this was, and I understood, as he said, I just don't have the strength to carry on. Well, I didn't know at that time what that meant. What it meant was basically his world was coming down, and it was going to come down on me.
I have to pause. Did you get this letter after his death?
Yes.
So, okay, so he planned this so that that you would have something to help you understand why he decided on an early departure.
He didn't give me much. I won't say that it was a, elaborate letter, but it was a letter. He'd written 4 letters to, and definitely, the one to me was really just his wanting to convey his love for me, and that he just couldn't carry on, and he had faith in me and what I would do. And I read that. I didn't get that until the day after he died. We found the letters. But all of this, Susan, is just to say that I lost, within 6 months, I had to quickly put our estate on the market, and it was not an easy estate to sell. And there's all sorts of incredible, miraculous things that happen. And the book is full of those stories, because I feel that I was very guided through this process, and that there were amazing miracles that happened. And there were incredibly hard things that happened. But within 6 months, it was like, sometimes I think I use the analogy or the visual of like my life was like gone, all that I'd planned, because it isn't just that you lose the life you have, it's that you lose the path forward. It's like an iceberg just cleaves away, and you're standing there on the edge of nothing. And yet you still have to step. And that's that thing of stepping into the void and saying, I don't know what will come, but I will make my path by walking the way of the mysterious woman. For me, it's like I will, and within 6 months, I was gone from my home, gone from my beloved. My cat passed away 3 days before I left. My beloved animal partner, which actually I'll just say was somewhat healing, if that's possible. But there's a story about that in the book. My community, I left. It was like everything was like that Tibetan.
I was going to say it was wiped away. And I love the image of standing on the edge. And before you go on, you've had a couple of powerful images that are interesting, because the idea of being shattered, I ran bereavement groups for a long time after my brother died, which was the first time I understood what darkness meant. And in that bereavement group, it was, there was the littles, the middles, the tweens, the teens, young adults, and adults. So there were groups for every age, starting at the age of 3. And I worked with the tweens, and we would take these clay pots, and they would break them, they would paint them, and they would put them back together again. And of course, the idea was that we rebuild our life. It doesn't look the same. There are holes where the light can shine in, right? I think it's Marianne Williamson, or I can't remember who said it, but we all have cracks. That's how the light gets in.
Leonard
Cohen. And that's the whole premise of, creating this new mosaic design when we are, because a deep loss, a traumatic loss really does shatter us in a way that, at least for me, where I felt like I was looking at my life shattered into a million pieces on the ground and not knowing how I was going to put that back together. And so I loved that image. But
well, can we stop with that image for a sec?
Yes.
Because I want to say, first of all, that's just so synchronous, because I write about this in the book. One of the ritual was a central healing tool that I used for the whole first, well, actually for the whole 10 years, but the whole first year especially, because ritual is a language that I teach in the work that I do, basically as a way that the unconscious and the conscious mind can communicate. And one of the really key rituals that we did, it was about a week after David died, and Michael Mead facilitated that for me, is that we invited the closest in friends and family to come to our house on the island. And what I wanted to have happen was, like, we were all shattered, and some way we needed to all come together and be able to speak what was so for us, rather than, because that's one of the great losses in the individualistic culture, that people grieve alone, that people are, ostracized. It's the suicide, you're over there, it's like, no, we actually need to come together. And the very start of the ritual, the way it began, I had chosen a vessel, and David collected amazing antique pottery from China, Asia. I had this one vessel that was probably 300 years old. It had one piece broken out of it. And I held that in front of the hearth of our big stone fireplace. One of my dear friends, and Andrea, who had been there, Andrea had been there, Antonia had been there that night when we found him, and had been the one to tell me that he had died. She's a shamanic practitioner along with being a therapist, and she was using her rattles and rattling. This frenetic rattling was incredible. It was like she must have had 8 hands. Something was being invoked. And when it got to the pitch of the energy, I took my vessel and I smashed it on the hearth. Yeah. And the whole room and me and everyone, we were all just like, whoa. And then Michael came in to speak about, out of the silence, to speak about how, well, this is an African tradition, actually, that they do. And that this is, in a way, a symbolic reckoning with where we all are, that we have been shattered. And there is no putting back together this, for me, that's why I did it. There's no way I could take those pieces and put them back into some kind of vessel, because it was so big, the shattering. It was going to be a bigger vessel needed for the future, not that one. But that's just such an interesting, I love that you did that, and that's being done.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's just such it's so powerful for the kids, right? Because most of these children have lost a parent. But something else and I knew this when I was reading about you. My brother he was a spar director and worked for Jambren Bay and Siam in Bali, Indonesia. And so when I had read that about the Bali, and I've been there twice, and I had to go back. I'm going to cry. I had to fly his ashes back to Bali. He ended up dying over in Hong Kong, long story. But just when I was reading about that, and I imagined when you were talking about the sacredness of what you had built together on this island, just the idea of this life that you had built, this sacred, beautiful, spiritual life, and for your partner to take his life, that to me too is, I don't know. I just think it brings the power of the myth that you were talking about around the underworld and the upper world too. I mean, the whole thing is so powerful. It's difficult to actually wrap my mind around the story that you're telling me. And okay, so here
I will say this one thing.
Yes.
Susan, because it is hard to wrap your mind around. I mean, in a way, I was not the person that does these. I had an amazing life. I had a kind of fairy tale life in a way. I felt, I sort of lived in a fairy tale. And that was the hard thing of just sort of reckoning, like, whoa, this is actually happening to me. And there is a way in which I was so committed from the very beginning not to do a spiritual bypass on this journey. I have a long time, multiple decades of a spiritual practice. And I was not going to meditate my way out of this, or it's all good and it's all for the better good. And when people, I still don't want to hear people say, I still have a hard time hearing people say, oh, well, these are the gifts. I don't think of them as gifts from the time. I think of them as offerings.
I love that.
Hard. It was horrific, but it was also holy. And so, but that was for me to walk. And that meant I was going to be real with what I felt and be in my body. And I knew how to, and I certainly deepened my capacity to be with all the emotions that I needed to be in my body going through this.
The word that comes to mind is amen. As this is exactly how I think and feel about, I call it the grief and loss journey, the life journey, whatever you want to call it, and the importance in honoring the humanness and all of the feelings that we feel. And I love the walking piece. Emotion is meant to move. And whether that is literally moving our body also helps us to move energy. And so I love that part too. Tell us when you started to write this book, because it sounds like this last 10 years has been, words escape me, just the transformation of your life from where you were and where you are, and writing. When did you start to write this book?
It's a great question because, again, I wasn't going to do a bypass. My first book wasn't even out yet, right? It was we were about to find a publisher. So there was no way I was starting this as and this was a real shift for me because so much, the heroic me, as I said, that was shattered. So I still can't believe people that come out with a book the year after a traumatic loss. I don't know how that happens. I just, for me, and maybe that's just me. So first thing was I had to complete this first book, which is this one, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, and with my co-author, Suzanne Anderson. So that came out in 2016. And I had been journaling as I went along, but that was really for me, doing my own journaling. And then once this book came out, I think it was probably 2018 or 19, so as I made my way back to my work again, I changed my whole business model. I was doing public programs that were all retreat-based programs. And then when the book came out, a lot of people around the world, I did a European tour, wanted to do the work. So I started to go online. So I then had to learn all the online things. And so my work began to expand. I was seeing one-on-one clients. And then I realized there's something I need to do. I need to go toward my journey for me. Like, I've got to write this for me. I didn't know if it was going to be for somebody else yet. And so and I know you do this work with people, so you understand that more than many. But I needed to go, and I had worked with many extremely skilled therapists and body workers and energy workers, and all of the ways that I worked through the trauma in the many years following David's death. But there was something for me to be able to walk back over my story with the consciousness I had at that point, to be able to reclaim myself. It was very hard. I would go away and do the writing in week-long retreats somewhere. I couldn't do it while trying to work with others, in my other roles. And the writing was very healing for me. And I would stream my writing down. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I have to ask this question. I've dealt with a lot of people who have lost people to suicide. I worked with people, in the grief groups who had lost people to suicide. And I think one of the pieces that people struggle with so much is woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? I mean, we've all heard it, what if. My question to you, though, being a psychologist, did you carry any guilt after David's death? Did you take on any of that? Did you replay over in your mind 1,000 times of missing signs? Like, I mean, I know my listeners are wondering the same thing because of your work. Did you carry any of that? Was that part of your journey?
Those are two different questions, and they're good to separate. One is, did you carry it? And the other is, did you think it? So I think, I can't imagine somebody wouldn't think that, wouldn't be thinking, what did I not see that first day? Now, I also know that David was very good, as many those that are going to choose to lead by suicide, at having this a sort of schizoid experience where it's like one life is the guy who's going to leave, who already had a plan, and one is the very high functioning person in the world. I must tell you that 2 days later, his niece, so his closest sibling, his sister, who lives here in this area, Seattle, and they were very close. Her daughter was getting married to the son of his closest friend in Indonesia, who had set him up in Java with a workshop and everything, and had managed his store in Seattle. They were all here from Indonesia, that whole family, okay? Because the wedding, he died on Thursday, the wedding was on Saturday. So there was nothing about this time that would tell any of us that David would ever take his life then, that he was struggling with the tinnitus, yes, that he was struggling with his financial world, obviously that was there, but he really kept these very separate. So, but of course, I went back over so many things and thinking, what did I miss? And of course I did miss things, but I didn't feel in any way responsible for his suicide. And if I had done something different, he wouldn't have done it. And I will say his letter to me helped me with that, probably, because he basically let me know that. But I already knew that. So I would say I went that feeling of, could I have stopped this? Could I have? Was there, I had thought those thoughts, I went through that, but I didn't carry it as a burden. In a way, that was his burden, and I didn't choose to carry that as a burden.
This is so powerful, I think, for our listeners to hear because the word choice, I chose not to carry it as a burden, I think is very important for people to hear, because if I had to say, some of the most painful parts of people healing is being able to set that burden down. And for some people, I think they carry it a lifetime. And so I appreciate, and I think the other powerful part of this is there was a big event that was coming up that was very meaningful to him, this wedding.
He was the night before this happened. We'd been at his sister's for a dinner for all the close family, and the Indonesians were all there. And he had made this amazing toast. He was the life of the party because he was the reason they were getting married.
Right.
And on the way home, he said, "This was the first night I didn't feel my tinnitus. This is amazing. I'm going to get through this." And then I don't know. I actually believe he'd already, for a number of reasons, I already believe he'd already had a plan. Whether he was going to do that plan right that next day, I'm not sure. I certainly went to bed hopeful that night that he was going to be okay, just in general, not about him taking his life, but just that he was going to be okay. And this wedding was going to be such an exciting and wonderful moment for him. But the other thing, Susan, I want to mention that goes along with the guilt is shame.
Yes.
This is the other key thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's really important to name it because I called it, and I'm sure others called it this, the suicide swamp of shame. I actually have the belief that we are all able to choose how we come into this world, and that we come into this world and how we go out of this world.
I support that, me as well.
Now, and this was his choice. So I don't like it. I didn't want it. I had to work my way very carefully and very genuinely toward forgiveness, which I did arrive at, but I was going to take the time to get there because of the impact on me, his family, his friends, the whole, it was an enormous thing that he did. And I am sure that shame was part of what took his boat down. The shame of what was about to happen, which was his business, was going to come crashing down. And as he said in the letter to me, I am so ashamed and I don't have the strength to carry on. So I know that was around him, that sense of shame. And had he been able to stay, we would have worked with him through that. All of us, his family, of course, his friends, I would have been 100% there with him. But what I, again, similar to guilt, had to be really careful was not taking that on. And what that meant, just to get super practical, so if anybody's listening that's in this situation, that was also, that for me meant going to the grocery store when I had the capacity to do that on a small island where everybody knows everyone, and standing up with my head up and being willing to look at those that were wanted to look at me, like not taking on this, because it's so hard. People don't know how to respond, and it is extremely hard to know how to respond to someone who's gone through, as a survivor of the suicide. But from my side, it was, and I didn't make up the story that, or some secret about what happened. I was very clear about what happened. That was what he chose to do. It's suicide. I didn't say he died some kind of obscure way. No, I chose as life went on to discern if I was meeting random people that I didn't know. I didn't always start out saying my husband died of suicide. That would not be necessary to do in the conversation, but I wasn't trying to hide that piece. So that's a hard piece of work to do. And it took friends around me to not take it on.
Yeah. My first episode of this podcast was a young woman who lost her father. It's local. It shook the whole area. He took his life and he hung himself in the garage, and his daughter found him. And the fallout of that, you can imagine, right, has just been it has literally just been horrific. And it's been a couple of years now. And I just had the mother on because she has found new love. One of the things I write about is how hope lives in the eye of despair. And I believe that. And then I just interviewed this young woman who lost both of her parents within 6 months of each other. And I'm going to ask you this question too, but I asked her the question hope is, and she said real. And it took her 2 to 3 years to believe that there is this thing called hope, right? And when we lose hope and we are in deep despair, as David was, people can choose to depart, and that is their choice, as you said. And then there is this incredible fallout. I want to bring us full circle because of time. When you were writing your way through this book, I'm going to just metaphorically, you were continuing to do your walk. And as you were walking through the pages of this book, and this is going to be hard, I know, to sort of sum up where you started, where were you when you started, and where did you feel like this journey of writing brought you? I don't know if I'm doing a great job of asking the question because it's a big question, I know, but you know what I'm getting at?
I think you're asking, how did you know when it ended, or how do you end? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, because when this walk through grief, we simply are not the same people anymore. Yeah. We're just not. It fundamentally changes us. So I'm just curious where you started in that book in 2018 or whenever you started that book, and where you ended. Was there an aha moment or something that happened for you during that journey? I guess is a better way to ask it.
It was the whole journey was so powerful for me because what started to reveal itself that I hadn't planned to do was that the last chapter of the first book, which lays out these, what I call meta capacities, these capacities that are trying to come online right now, that are to meet the complexity of this moment in time that we live in. There were 8 of them. And when I was writing all my stories, what started to show itself was like, oh my God, I was actually living these capacities. And all of a sudden it was like the frame started to show itself to me. So that's really powerful, because if others they won't walk my journey, but if they could have these guideposts, let's say, as they're going through their own journey, as they're making their own path, it could make a real difference for them. And so then I started connecting the dots, in a sense, between the first book and the second book. And it started to make just this coherence that I thought, this is going to be useful. This could be useful for somebody, not just, I don't think just my memoir I felt would have been enough because I'm a teacher. I think I felt I wanted to be able to offer some guide. It's my nature. And so I showed it to my editor from the first book and said, now I want you to read this honestly and see if you think this could be useful. And she said, oh my God, you have to make this a book. And in a way, I want this to be the book I couldn't find. And I don't mean that it wasn't available. I just didn't find it when this happened for me, which was basically, I mean, I really lost, and this is true in the work I do now with women. I lost everything. I lost all our money. So everything, that I thought I had to retire on, what I thought I was going to be able to do the next year. I lost my home. I lost my partner, my path forward. I mean, there's no place that I can't meet people in what it is to lose, to lose. And we're in a world right now where a lot of the status quo is being shaken up. We're all losing things, even if we haven't gone through a trauma. And we maybe went through the COVID trauma. And
I was going to say, I mean, just the global losses from the pandemic alone. And we're at the tip of the iceberg, the fallout from that, which of course we see in the mental health and the crisis in mental health right now. But anyway, please keep going.
Yeah, well, just to say that's what I would want this book to be a guide for, so that we're going when things fall apart, whether it's the world, the global situation, or these are the capacities that can actually start to come online. They can come online because we're broken open. The transformation that's possible, that I'm interested in myself, and has happened and is happening in the women I work with, is to wake up more fully to my own capacity to love, to embrace differences, to own my wisdom at all levels, my power. I mean, really show up in the world right now as someone that future generations would be grateful for, but how do we get there? And I think transformation is so potentially, it's like an accelerator during trauma. And that's why I ultimately wrote the book. I thought if this can be helpful, I want it to be out there.
Well, I know that it's coming out in June. Do you want to hold it up just so people can see the cover? Can people pre-order? Is Amazon or anybody taking pre-order? Okay, so let's get I've got 2 questions for you that I end every episode with. Before I get to those, though, tell people where they can find you. I know that your website, I think it's just Suzanne Anderson. Is that correct?
No, it is not, actually. No.
Oh, because I've got
www.mysterialwoman.com.
Oh, okay. Because I've been all over the web listening to your YouTube videos. Okay, so
yeah, no, it's Mysterial Woman, MYSTERIAL woman.com. And by the way, the word mysterial is a word that I made up.
I thought so. I love it.
And it's now registered. I've actually claimed it as a word, but it's this hybrid. We started to see these new ways of being emerging in women, and we didn't have a way to describe them. And it had to do with bringing together mystery and medial. But you can read more about that in the first book.
Oh, I thought, yeah, I loved it. I thought that perhaps that was your word, and I just absolutely loved it. And you also have a women's leadership course starting on February 18th. Is that correct?
Right.
And I know that it's a limited number. I don't know how many spots do you have left at this point?
We have a handful left right now. We take a maximum of 24 women.
Okay.
We're right in the last forming phases right now. And there's a lot more to find out. When you go to the website itself, then you'll see the emergence program. So Mysterial Leadership Emergence is the actual program. It's a 15-month program, and it basically is a deep dive into the shadow of how do we unhook from the old, very limited codes and beliefs that are deep down in the DNA that have held us, I believe, hostage as women, and grow the capacity to really show up in the world in our lives and with others in a really potent way right now. So it's a very intimate and rich journey. If anyone's interested, definitely reach out soon.
And is that a weekly commitment? Like, is it just, I
No,
just want to
it's
give listeners some
it's
kind of,
I'll give the listeners that idea. It's a that you got to think about it like this container comes in around your life because you're like in this great field through which you're looking at all the ways you are in it. So that's to say that's 15 months of just this container around you. But then we meet once a month as a whole circle. We're from all over the world, so once a month is everybody. And then once a month is with a smaller flock, we call it, of women. And then you have learning partners you meet with in between times. It's all online except for a final retreat, which is a 5-day, 4-night retreat here in the Pacific Northwest, where we just finished the last program in December, and people came from all over the world meeting each other after this deep journey together. And it was just incredible.
it sounds like pure magic to me. All right. So finish these two pieces for me. The first one is, what does self-love look like for you? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, self-love. I always want to put my hands on my heart
Me too.
when I go to self-love. It's really for me, and even and I'd say this profoundly happened during the last 10 years since David died. I thought I loved myself, but I often left myself out of the equation and taking care of everybody else and being a change maker and all of that. So now I'd say it's just like being with my humanity, who I am, and my limitations, and that way, and my beauty, my gifts, and accepting all of those parts of myself and the deep soul essence that lives in, breathes through, expresses through my perfectly imperfect human self.
I love that. Okay. And here's the last one. I want you to finish this sentence. Hope is ...
Hope is in the heart and found moment to moment as you make your path by walking.
Thank you. I want to thank you so much for coming here, for sharing your wisdom, your story,
Thank you.
and your heart with us. And I have to, and this incredible work that you are doing in the world with women, I just want to thank you for that as well. And I encourage all of you to please go check out Suzanne's site and the different things that she is offering. Pre-order her book. And I want to thank you all, my listeners, for being here again today and showing up. I love you all and have a wonderful week. Bye for now.